This will be the third webinar dedicated to Thomas Sebeok, and today we are going to talk about the connection between Sebeok and biosemiotics. So first talk will be by me. I'm going to give a more broader introduction and to talk about something that I consider a kind of third approach in semiotics. And thereafter, Zara will present more a specific topic about modeling theory, pretty much developed by Thomas Sebeok. And after that, we will have also half an hour for questions and comments and discussion. So I now try to share my screen with you. I hope you are able to see that. I would start with a general question that if we look now from current perspective, Thomas Sebeok's work, then what would be the lasting contribution and importance of Sebeok to biosemiotics and semiotics in more general? He's well known by arguing for a connection between semiosis and life, and thereby building a foundation for biosemiotics movement. And this idea that the beginning of life also is a beginning of semiosis, or that life equals semiosis, actually is presented in many papers written by Thomas Sebeok, and it seems to gain a more solid form in his recent writings. He himself has called this understanding theorema, and in some secondary sources it has been referred to as Sebeok's maxim. And I actually very much suggest using this frame also for a reason of somehow fixing or keeping his memory, his name in the history of semiotics. So let us talk about Sebeok's maxim. Sebeok also developed semiotic understanding of animal communication, and he was an establisher of zoosemiotics, introduced concepts of code and developed zoosemantics in animal communication studies, published on semiotic analysis of naming, play behavior, lying, mimicry on animals, and also expressed critical views of animal language research. And I think we can say that Sebeok was a great synthesizer in the sense that he picked up ideas for many different traditions and from many different authors. In his works, we can find influences, for instance, by Roman Jakobson, the way how he understood and approached communication, or by Yuri Lotman, the discussions over modeling systems and semiosphere, or also by Noam Chomsky, Sebeok's understanding of biological basis of language and language as a cognitive tool mostly, but also by Jakob von Uexküll as understanding that animal communication and perception of the world is species specific, and interpreting Umwelt as a model. And there are many other influences as well. And Sebeok somehow was in different dialogues at the same time and was also able to synthesize these different influences. But I think that perhaps most central concept or most central kind of understanding for Sebeok was using models and modeling systems as a kind of central tool to bring these different influences together. And this again is something that is present in many of his papers up to the very last essays, and also in the book Modeling System Theory, written together with Marcel Tonesi. Our own biosemiotic professor Kalevi Kull has written several papers dedicated to Thomas Sebeok's legacy, and one of these was titled The Architect of Biosemiotics, Thomas Sebeok and Biology, published in the collection Semiotics Continues to Astonish. And Kalevi Kull brings there out several topics where Thomas Sebeok has been influential to biosemiotics. And of course, he gave a lot of organizational support to the development of biosemiotic paradigm, but there are also some important theoretical insights that were essential for understanding semiosis in living world. For instance, Sebeok's understandings of science and semiosis was surely rooted in biology, as in Uexküll's Umwelt concept, but also in ethological tradition, processes of ritualization and instinct and code, but also in Persian tradition, in Persian concepts of iconic and indexical science. And he developed semiotics as a comparative science by including codes, semantics, and communication systems of other species to the semiotic analysis as well. And he also broadened Lotman's concept of semiosphere to cover semiosis and science systems of other species besides humans. So those are a few points that Kalevi Kull makes to emphasize the importance of Thomas Sebeok. So when looking back to his work now, after 20 years, there's an additional feature that I want to stress that is probably central to Sebeok's thinking. Namely, in his semiotics, to the tradition that I would like to call the third way of thinking in semiotics. The third way, shortly saying, is an ontological position that does not consider human culture and science systems limited in themselves and separated from the rest of the biosemiosis and physical sphere. Such detached view is quite common in classical structuralism and post-structuralism. And also, the third way thinking does not reduce the complexities of human culture and language to the simple science systems and processes by eliminating this demarcation line between human and non-human semiosis. And such reductionism can be common both in biological determinism, but also on the other extreme in several postmodernist and posthumanist critical approaches to animal communication and cognition that try to argue that animals are capable of doing all similar things that we humans are. So the third way is a kind of intermediate ontological position, and due to that, it also enables to make connections and to bridge. In another possible terminology, we could call the first way of thinking as modernist thinking, the second way of thinking as postmodernist, and the third way of something like ecological postmodernist. And this was a terminology used by Charlene Spretnak, American feminist theorist and also environmental humanities author. So what is specific about the third way thinking is that it organizes semiotic processes of humans and other species diversity landscape, at the same time also recognizing the differences of complexity between semiotic processes Such view also pays attention to the constraints and limits of the semiotic system. System's own activity, connecting different hierarchy levels, providing feedback and homeostasis is an important aspect of this view. And what becomes especially the point of interest are connections, interactive processes between different complexity levels. And I do not want to say that Thomas Sebeok is the only author developing this view. Clearly, it is present in many semiotic scholars that are related to the systems thinking or cybernetics. Such approach is present in the works of Gregory Bates, and I think also in works of Wendy Wheeler and many others. But it's quite remarkable that also in different topics, what Sebeok has written about this position is quite present and evident. And I think also Paul Cobley, when he has described biosemiotics as bridging the epistemological gap, then he also develops a view that can be considered as belonging to this third way movement. In 2010, in the paper Cultural Implications of Biosemiotics, published in journal Biosemiotics, Paul Cobley illustrates the potential of biosemiotics as providing an intermediate position to agency that would allow connecting culture and biological realms. And I quote, biosemiotics introduces agency into nature and in the process will redraw the lines of science and the humanities. The problem with the latter is that the culture already has agency in bucket loads. Indeed, it has more than it knows what to do with. The main cultural implication of biosemiotics, as opposed to the most glaring, must be then that the done scientism of mechanic talk, sociobiology and determinism, which has been rejected by culture, does not have to be replaced by autonomy, agency, free will and other myths. Mechanisms can be replaced by a perspective that is not just culture-friendly as agency in nature, but provides a scientific outlook, continuity of organisms, matter and mind, which can underpin while qualifying understanding of culture's cherished irreducible features, and at the same time also undermining the extravagant individualist, anthropocentric, glottocentric claims of culturalism. And I think this pretty much summarizes what this third way would be, how biosemiotic thought can be relevant and potential for cultural studies. And also what's interesting is that Paul Cobley identifies Thomas Sebeok's role by leading the road to this third intermediate position, and especially in regard to animal language debate. But I think that this tendency of taking this intermediate position and to argue for a middle ground between the opposites, or to bridge these, is more characteristic to Sebeok's semiotics. The very same approach can be noticed aside of animal language debates also in other theoretical topics like Sebeok's ideas on semiotic self, and also in his thoughts about development of animal aesthetics and arts. So I'm shortly going to cover a few theoretical topics where this position is present in Sebeok's works. Let us first continue Sebeok's thinking in animal language and communication. His position in the debate over qualitative or quantitative distinction between communication skills in humans and animals remains intermediate. On one hand, he considers semiosis as communication as traits that are common to all living creatures. But on the other hand, he holds the position that there are crucial differences between humans and other species. He understands language linguistically, by emphasizing the specific structural organization that allows, based on having syntax, to combine smaller and stable units into potentially infinite numbers of higher level units or sentences or texts. And this language capacity opens up possibilities to express different things, as both those that have happened here and now, but also to remember past, to model future, and to create possible worlds. So language as such, in the strict sense, according to Sebeok, is present only in human animals, and he considers correspondingly talking about animal language as metaphorical, and suggests that it would be better to avoid this at all. So talking about language of bees is metaphor at best. And this position goes hand in hand with the understanding that human language should stay outside of the domain of zoosemiotic studies. And in his writings, Sebeok also expresses critical views towards anthropomorphization and over-interpretation of animal communication, as well as towards so-called animal language programs or projects that were especially popular in United States in the 1960s. He repeatedly questioned the methodology and scientific objectivity of these projects, and argued that in many cases communicative relation between the researcher and the animal may explain seemingly extraordinary results in animal language usage. So, for instance, by involvement of clever Hans phenomenon that denotes the effect of researchers' expectations on the results of a research conducted with animals through involuntary communication. And so Sebeok positions himself between the two opposites. On one hand, he allows semiosis and communication to all animals, but on the other hand, he keeps language and syntax as something that is specific to humans. And taking such intermediate position actually does not make Sebeok favorable to neither of camps. Semioticians working with human culture and language consider him perhaps too revolutionary, whereas people involved in animal language studies, and especially in emerging cognitive ethology movement, consider his views too traditional and too limiting. And also in like more recent publications in cognitive ethology and animal studies, Sebeok's name is not quoted or mentioned almost at all. Now, another topic where Sebeok's intermediate position is well perceivable is his original concept of semiotic self. This tradition of thinking is elaborated in 4 short essays. Semiotic Self, first published in 1977, Semiotic Self Revisited, published in 89, Tell Me Where Is Friendship Ed, the Biosemiotic Self, published in 1991, and the Cognitive Self and the Virtual Self, published in 1998. And these essays discuss different aspects of semiotic self, from biological to virtual aspects, and also paint us the picture of self as multi-layered and contextual entity. According to Sebeok, semiotic self has a multi-layered structure based on all memory-capable codes in the body, including at least immunological, neurological, cognitive, and in the case of human animals, also verbal and narrative layers. Semiotic self is not permanent, but developing and conditional with regard to organisms' life cycle and surrounding circumstances. Semiotic self is engaged in continual scanning or monitoring or the process of meta-interpretation of its modeling systems. So semiotic self is situational and rooted into organisms' ontogenetic development. And then this claim allows Sebeok to pose interesting questions regarding to animals' self-image, such as does animals' self-image include an awareness of its detachable appendages, as in the case of different reptiles, or what about its body odors or its image reflected in the water or on the ground, and so forth. So based on Sebeok's writing, it seems that an essential property of semiotic self is an ability to make distinctions, to distinguish between the self and the other. Or in other words, semiotic self is characterized by an ability of self-recognition. And this self-recognition, it is always probable, not absolute. And this means that there's also a possibility of making errors, as in the case of some autoimmune disease where a body interprets part of its own as an alien, or in the case of phantom pain felt in missing limb, and so forth. So this making this distinction and projecting this semiotic self is probable, and it can also include, in the case of humans, virtual self as a projection of semiotic self onto pseudo-reality, as Sebeok calls that. And aside of this semiotic self, which basically is a kind of endosemiotic dimension of Sebeok's writings, there's also an important aspect now that connects this with human cultural modeling, and this comes from Sebeok's understanding of zoosemiotic modeling as kind of prelinguistic and non-verbal form of human meaning making. So Sebeok argues that aside of linguistic modeling, there is also a kind of zoosemiotic layer of modeling where distinctions that are made in our umwelt are put in the correspondence with our behavioral and kind of action-based activities. And from here, the long discussion between Tartu semiotics and Yuri Lotman derives about what is a primary and what is a secondary modeling system. But I hope that Sarah will cover this more in detail. But I think the crucial point here is that here again we can see that Sebeok takes a kind of intermediate position that allows him to bridge both, let's say, more biosemiotic ground or subject matter, and then cultural layers of narrative and textual meaning making. And the third topic where the similar approach is evident or present has to do with aesthetic behavior and art in animals and humans. And this is especially present in his essay, Prefigurements of Art, published already in 1979. And here in this text, on one hand, Sebeok describes aesthetic behavior in many different modalities, distinguishing between kinesthetic, musical, pictorial, and architectural signs in different species. And so considers basically artistic behavior as broadly present in many non-human species, and provides a great number of examples on that. But at the same time, he keeps the distinction between verbal or non-verbal art, or art that is based on primary modeling and art that is based on secondary modeling. Or we can also say kind of natural aesthetics, natural art, and then conceptual art or conceptual aesthetics. And so again, he's kind of playing in this middle ground, at the same time creating distinction, but also creating bridge or creating the kind of ability to or possibility to connect these different sides by allowing artistic and aesthetic behavior also to non-human species. And here along the discussion about the non-functionality of art and aesthetic behavior will develop, so that it's not just about functional causes as connected to sexual selection and training, but due to the broad number of different forms that there can be. Indeed, there must be some other role that aesthetic behavior has for animals. And Sebeok notes that the art and aesthetic experience may have a certain homeostatic function that helps to keep organisms' inner sensations, we would say innerwelt in Exculian terms, in balance with its environment. So aesthetic behavior has to do something with homeostasis and keeping balance. And again, in this aspect, this intermediate third position is, I think, quite telling. So to conclude, in my understanding, the importance and potential of the third way of thinking is that it allows to connect, to heal, to bridge, but at the same time, it respects the complexities and self-regulation of different semiotic systems that we are studying. And such approach is very badly needed for addressing the different problems that we have in the 21st century, as for instance, ecological problems. Thomas Sebeok did not explicitly wrote much about ecology, but I think his project of global semiotics has much of potential also for ecological thinking, because basically there he, and also quite explicitly, connects classical semiotics and biosemiotics. And he wrote about this in his book of global semiotics. And I think also in his view about biosphere, or how to interpret biosphere semiotically, this aspect is present. So I quote, he describes semiotic biosphere as follows: it would in effect mean that all message generators and sources and destinations or interpreters would be regarded as participants in one giant semiotic web. And if so, this would at least affect the style of future semiotic discourse. So a global semiotics, as depicted by Sebeok, it includes bio or zoosemiotics, non-verbal behavior, non-verbal semiosis, musical semiotics, semiotics of art, and so forth, in all its geographic and theoretical complexity. And I think in today, it's very essential to find this type of analytic position that would allow us to be in dialogue with different subject domains, to translate forth and back between different paradigms and conceptual systems, and also to alternate between global and local perspectives. And here is a further way of thinking in semiotics that is, well, very much present in Sebeok's work, allows us to bridge, to connect, to bring together. And I think this part in his legacy definitely has very strong potential also to address 21st century semiotics and problems of our contemporary world. So I will stop here and give floor now to Sarah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Timo. So I'll take over from here. I'm just sharing my screen. Okay, so I'm going to cover, as Timo mentioned, after this broad overview, I'm going to cover one specific aspect of Thomas Sebeok's work, particularly that pertaining to modeling system theory, which has been at the center of much of my work in semiotics and biosemiotics for a few years. And I will try to add some of the more recent reflection that I have brought to this work in regard to analog modeling systems. So perhaps I will skip the content, or it will get a bit boring. I will start, in fact, from the beginning. So in terms of modeling system theory, we do know that it's been, I don't know if my screen allows to see it. Yeah, it's been published in this book, and the very first section of this book starts with introducing the idea of models. So the idea of models as forms. So the introduction from Sebeok and Danesi defines the forms of as a mental form or an external form. If it is external, it's often visualized, and it's been so a model is a form that has been externalized through some usually physical medium to stand for a reference or for a class of reference, such as objects, events, and feelings. In other words, a model can be generally understood in relation to its capacity to refer to something else other than itself, so to its referential capacity. An interesting feature of models is that what they allow to do, so what you can do. So the amount of change that it introduces in the species, things, living beings that produce the models, which is they allow, for example, people to recognize patterns in things. They act as predictive guides or plans for taking action, and they serve as exemplars for specific kinds of phenomena. And the typical example that I bring is the London Underground map, which Londoners call Tube, which is a simplified models of the real distances and times that the actual positioning of the underground station have on a standard city map. So that's a typical model, and that's just to show that the study of models goes hand in hand with the study of their function. So how they simplify, for example, the task of planning a journey, or perhaps complicate it. Sometimes it is faster to take a bike rather than the public transport. So in that sense, I would rather say the function of a model is in regards the amount of change, that the degree of change that it brings to the person who produces it or uses it. And perhaps the last feature I will mention is how models differ from their source inspirations in terms of the most emphatic attributes being modeled. So the example that I will bring here is that of this word in English that is the nag. So that this expression indicates a person who is unknowingly trying to convince someone to do something else, often in a perhaps irritating or angry manner. So this model of the nag emphasizes some aspects. So the verifiable outside external behavior, but not so much the reasons that brings a person to behave in such a way. and also have once seen a pub sign called the Nug, which represented a woman. So again, models represent some aspects of that they're representing and omit others. So to do a bit of the history of where these interest with models come from, well, the actual process of producing models is what Sebeok called modeling, and Sebeok notion of modeling owes much to the Tartu Moscow School of Semiotics, particularly their idea of semiotic modeling systems, for which here I have a very classic citation from Yuri Lotman, who defines a semiotic modeling system as a structure of elements and of rules for combining them that is in a state of fixed analogy to the entire sphere of an object of knowledge. So what's interesting about this definition, of course, is that we have elements and the rules, and we have a sphere, so we have a system that is changing and dynamics. So it's a form of dynamic system theory, if I could call it as such. The other elements is that systems that have a natural language as the basis and that acquire supplementary superstructure, thus creating languages of a second level, can appropriately be called secondary modeling system. And this is the peculiarity of the definition and the modeling system, the semiotic modeling system proposed by Tartu Moscow School, where we have a primary modeling system considered as, it would be verbality, but it would be based on the idea that everything can be considered as a text. But this primary modeling system would also include pictorial signs, for example. And then there is a secondary modeling system which would be instantiated in culture at the level of institutions such as art, economics, law, and religion. So the idea is that there is this primary modeling system, a linguistic system, which is considered as a universal science system upon which more complex superstructure or cultural superstructure can grow or develop. And this semiotic modeling combines both a structural synchronic approach, so a picture of the map, say, of a model of the map of an object at a specific point in time, but also diachrony, so the history of that object or systems or set of objects and how they're moving or developing across time or even evolving. And these systems, another peculiarity of Tartu Moscow School is that these modeling systems are in continuous tension. They are mutually translating and at the same time not being fully translatable. And that is a key aspect that brings change and innovation, development and evolution in a system, for example, a cultural system. So Sebeok was inspired by the modeling systems notion of Tartu Moscow School, and he confirmed his understanding of it in this paper called "In What Sense is Language a Primary Modeling System?" And then he also proposes a reconfiguration of that. So the paper was initially part of the proceedings of the 25th Symposium of the Tartu Moscow School of Semiotics, happening in Imatra in 1987. And as I've learned from Marlene Anderson, this address was taped and transcribed by John Dealey, who had a habit of audio taping Thomas Sebeok, both formal lectures and informal lectures. And Sebeok authorized this transcription with his edits because he didn't have time to contribute to a written manuscript. And that became such a masterpiece of semiotics, biosemiotics, and modern system theory. And it is one of those pieces that I read over and over and over, and every time there is something new that I can learn from it. So fundamentally, what Sebeok does, he acknowledged the fundamental contribution that the Tartu-Mosto scholar brought to semiotics with their emphasis on modeling, particularly the idea of space, history, and innovation through translation, and of course, the derivational character of culture in relation to verbality. However, at the same time, he proposed a change. He focused on the primary modeling systems, and he proposes that the modeling systems, which, as he called them in the 1980s, the Soviet scholars called primary, but which in truth is phylogenetically as well as ontogenetically secondary to the nonverbal. So in this sense, he splits the Tartu-Moscow semiotics primary modeling system into separate ones. And that's because he thought that the scholars did not sufficiently take into account our species' evolutionary history, that is, how humans could model, communicate, and generate culture, presumably before mastering externalized verbal sign. And therefore, he proposing in this paper a phylogeny of modeling. So he proposes to look at modeling across the evolution of man. So he reminded how hominids would have relied on nonverbal communication while verbality was developing. And that, so verbal language, both gestural and spoken, likely emerged in Homo sapiens about 200,000 years ago, although the date is always quite ever-changing. And I cannot really find an agreement as to when a verbal language emerges in the literature. So the faculty of verbal display in gestural speech depended on a capacity for syntax, which Sebeok calls a mute modeling device in his chapter. That would allow, for example, facilitating the manufacture of tools with standardized techniques, which happen with Homo erectus, but yet not yet to externalize and articulate linear speech, which happens with Homo sapiens sapiens. At a very simple level, a mute modeling device would also be what would allow humans to build tools, but at a basic level, and to learn from each other how to build them. So who to transfer, well, maybe not transfer, but to teach the technique to the next of kin. But to trade tools, then just when language was needed, and well, verbal language was needed, and that's when big structures like mining and factories, so-called the tools factories, emerged during Neolithic times. So in the meanwhile, before verbality, humans would have relied, like all mammals, on vocal calls and songs, as well as the faculties of other less controllable sense and expressive related organs. And Sebeok reminded in this chapter that this natural language evolved as an adaptation for cognition, whereas speech developed out of language as a derivative exaptation. So it was not strictly necessary for survival, although it allowed to build and expand on the repertoires of human activities. And then there is here I take a step back to, so before coming to modeling system theory, to non-syntactic, non-verbal communication, which is pretty much at the basis of modeling system theory. So these are the essays from Sebeok. Communication is one of the first essays that I have read, in fact, from my undergraduate years, and its beginning is one that it still stands very strong for me. So the idea that communication decreases entropy in a system, and that the first forms of communication would have been symbiotic relationship within cells, and that the development of semiotics equals the evolutions of life, the development, sorry, of semiotic communication. So Sebeok in this a further essay on nonverbal communication remembered how the earliest forms of interorganismic communication in our biosphere are to be found in bacteria, and how communication can take place within an organism that would include biological codes like genetic, metabolic, and immune systems, and so on. But also it would take place within ecological systems, or say within Gaia, for example, the idea of a system of ecological systems. So non-syntactic communication is common to all living beings, including animals, plants, fungi, protista, and monera. And he reminds how all living organisms communicate exclusively through nonverbal means, with the sole exception of some members of the species Homo sapiens. That would have been Homo neanderthalensis, which, well, is no longer here apart from in our genes, who communicate by both nonverbal and verbal means. So basically, Sebeok declared that only hominids, modern hominid would, modern Homo would possess two mutually sustaining repertoires of signs: the zoosemiotic nonverbal, that would be non-syntactic, and the anthroposemiotic verbal and syntactic. And to just emphasize the non-syntactic communication, this would be the repository of actual preconscious and conscious feelings or emotions, affects, and memory. So quite often, whilst during everyday life, we focus on what we are communicating in words, we are not always conscious. In fact, most of the time, we are not conscious at all of anything that is happening within our body, including our feelings, sense of awareness, and which is one of the reasons why, for example, those researching emotions such as anger underline how important it is to uncover the feelings that are subsumed in anger, such as usually sadness or shame or hurt. So in this sense, nonverbal communication of anger would be the repository of other feelings which are too painful to surface. So as they are, like sadness, so they surface in another form. So to just to recapitulate from Tartu Moscow through non-syntactic language, so Sebeok had split the Tartu Moscow semiotics primary modeling system into two, and had inserted this non-verbal, non-syntactic elements at the very first primordial level of modeling. So he proposed with Danesi, so this work culminates with modeling system theory, which he proposed with Danesi in 2000 as a comprehensive framework for the analysis of sign systems. That would be, and systems is a word that is, well, it's quite foregrounded in the title, in fact. So a system can be a single sign, in fact, a text, a social habit, or a cultural system. And this is how this work becomes relevant to cultural semiotics, and particular links culture to nature. So modeling system theory categorizes all types of signs and the relation amongst them produced by living beings. And that's why, for me, I see modeling system theory as a clear, explicit, and obvious instance of system thinking. So what we have is signs and relation, and a classic definition of system thinking is elements and the relation. So MST investigates how models are constructed, what the species-specific functions are, and how they generate forms of meaning. And there are a few principles that Sebeok and Danesi states, which structure modeling system theory. The key one for us is the extensionality principle, because it emphasizes the derivational character of culture from nature, which MST takes from Tartu Moscow semiotics. Well, or at least perhaps not entirely, but certainly it can rest on what it inherits from Tartu Moscow semiotics notion of modeling. So modeling system theory is one of the fruits of an evolutionary branch of semiotics that has to be called biosemiotics, and that's a quote from the book. And in the book itself, Sebeok and Danesi states that biosemiotics studies the semiotic behavior of all living things. And throughout the books, examples from culture and nature instances or instantiation of modelings are presented. So what do modeling systems look like after all this work? So we have a primary modeling system, which is a biologically natural ability to model the sensory property of object within the umwelt through iconic representational forms of various types. We have, so for example, this would be the instinctive ability of a child to imitate through vocalization the parent's voice. Secondary modeling system holds the potential to make reference to object through indexical forms, so indicative and extensional, with syntax being its defining feature, and that be the child's ability to point and learn to build things as well as to encode speech eventually. And tertiary modeling system is the capacity to further extend secondary models to acquire symbolic values constituting cultural superstructure. And that's when the more mature child engages in more symbolic modeling. For example, understanding irony and jokes, which comes a bit later on. So I'm going to just conclude with a reflection on the Persian influence on modeling system theory. So there's a lot of influences that can be traced, that modeling system theory can be traced to, for example, which I haven't mentioned. I have mentioned system thinking, I haven't mentioned cybernetics, but I'm going to stick to Pairs here because this is something that has left me wondering for some time. So this sentence, the three types of modeling systems correspond grosso modo to what Charles Peirce called firstness, secondness, and thirdness. So I've always wondered about the nature of this grosso modo relation. So why would that be a general relation rather than a correspondence between modeling system theory and Peirce level? So we've looked a bit into this. So Danesi recalls how firstness in Peirce associate with iconicity. Secondary modeling is extensional indexical, and that amounts to forms of secondness. And tertiary modeling systems is marked by Danesi as a thirdness form of knowing. So there is a reference to the sign types of icon index symbols. Furthermore, in the essay previously mentioned by Timo as well, Prefigurements of Art, Sebeok characterized organic forms like kinesthetic signs or musical signs and pictorial signs as artistic products of a verbal semiotic system. So These would be instances of primary modeling systems. However, they are statistics, so they would contain an element of symbolicity. Would that be an instance of thirdness? That's the question. And then throughout the book, there are some examples of natural indexicality, albeit not many, for example, in the chapter on secondary modeling. Symbolicity, so that's here, hence the picture of the bowerbird mating behavior, the bird that collects object of the color and shape that he thinks the likely female partner is going to be attracted to. And here we have a statement from Danesi, which mentioned that primary modeling is iconic, yet is also deictic and indexical. So my question would have been, how can modeling system theory allow primary modeling system to be indexical and symbolic? If there was a straightforward correspondence between Persian categories and modeling systems, then this would not be allowed. A primary form could not also be a tertiary form, and thirdness could not contain thirdness, only the other way around, so thirdness could contain firstness. And so after discussing with Nadine Anderson, we've come to this. So there's no reason why Persian category should fit neatly into modeling system theory. And modeling system theory has been written as an advanced textbook, and the categories seem paradigmatic and distinct. But that is in contrast to all of Peirce continuous and the third example, which are analog. So Sebeok mentioned that despite Peirce once stating uncommonly loosely that a sign is either an icon, an index, or a symbol, he realized that the usefulness of his trichotomy was enhanced by recognizing that if not actually signs, discrete signs, but other aspects of the sign that are being classified. So a sign might exhibit more than one aspect, and signs are labeled after the aspect that ranks predominance. So we are talking of gradation, nuances, and analog aspects of the sign. That means that all externalized signs necessarily partake of secondness, even if they're primarily model, they contain an indexical level. And despite the definition of modeling system in modeling system theory as the primary modeling system as the innate category for simulative modeling. So this category is only foregrounded the iconic aspects of primary forms, but not exclusively categorizing it as such. So I would conclude that the primary, secondary, tertiary modeling systems are loosely based on analog sign levels and have to be seen as quasi-paradigmatic. And that's how I would understand the modeling system theory today. And to just recap on what I've said, I've mentioned models as forms of meaning with a function, the Tartu-Moscow semiotic modeling system as a structure of elements of rules with an iconic component to the sphere, biosphere for shorthand. Sebeok splitting of primary modeling system into natural language and verbality, and modeling system theory, which joins cultural semiotics and biosemiotics. There is a strong Persian influence, but not the straightforward correspondence. And primary, secondary, and tertiary modeling systems embody analog aspects of the signs. And that is it. That is it for me. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for a talk. Well, we haven't actually decided how to organize the discussion, but I hope if you can raise your virtual hand in the case if you want to ask, then this would be good way forward. And if Sarah could also close your presentation or stop sharing, then we could all see.
I'm trying to close it.
Yeah. Take your time.
Oh yeah. Okay. I found the button. Cool. Thank you.
Okay. So please, if you have questions or comments?
Yes.
Václav, yes, please.
Zdzisław, yes, Zdzisław. Yes. I wanted to take stand to the notion of the self you had in your paper, yes? Namely, you quoted first Pearl Cobley speaking about agentivity. It was a general remark. Yes, and then you went to Tom Sebeok's The Notion of the Semiotic Self, which included also the animal and the human self, yes, the organismic and the personal self. And this is the problem connected with languages, of course. In English and in German, you have this category, yes? In English, it is the self, and das Selbst in German. And we have also in Polish, jaźń, ja means ego, yes? The category was introduced. As I checked in some languages, in Russian does not exist. So we have samoanalys or samostoyatelny, etc. If we, for example, try to give lectures in Spanish, I had such an opportunity in Colombia, Bogota. So then you may notice that the Latin-based languages do not have such a distinction between I and me, yes, as it is also present at moi in French, yes, but in French, of course, the self does not exist. So, for example, Starasti, he translated this after, yes, Jacques Fontanier, moi and soi, yes. This was the reference to the individual as a personal self, and to the individual as a social self, yes, soi. And in Spanish, for example, you may speak about yo, yes, and but also ser as being, yes, existing, yes, but el mismo, it exists also, that it refers to the moi, yes. So, in fact, this notion, the self, comes from William James, and it was also used by George Mead. It refers to two existence modes of the human individual, yes, of the organism, that is subjective and objective. When the subject becomes the object of reflection, it refers to the body, So then body and mind are two existence modes of the same individual, yes? So it is important to communicate about such opportunities, how to speak about the self. Of course, Sebeok used the English term. Here he referred to also to the bodily existence of the semiotic self. So then for him, therefore, it was the self which existed both in nature and culture. Therefore, he has extended the notion of modeling to three, yes, kinds. So this is only my short remark. Of course, I have also to mention, that's a pity we don't have Susan Petrilli, because she wrote about the self, yes, and the semiotic self, etc. And she used a lot of translations into Italian. Yes. Hi, Maiden. Nice to see you. And of course, if we write in English, we have no problems. But if we try to do it in any other language, like Latin American, then we have to use the replacements. Yes. thank you very much for your attention, and thank you also for your excellent presentation, because it is good to know the topic, if I have studied it earlier, what you presented in your paper, Timo Maran, yes? And the same refers to the lady whose name I could not remember here, the second paper, yes? And so this modeling systems and Marcel Danesi, etc. So this is very important, yes, for the training of every semioticians, indeed, yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for comments and developing this more in depth. Perhaps would like to add only a few small things. I think that in connecting Sebeok's understanding of semiotic self with anthropological tradition and with works of Herbert Mead and Dewey, I think this is very much correct. There is a continuity there. For Sebeok, what is interesting, at least for me, is that he considers this semiotic self as a kind of multi-layered concept, basically based on every code or every kind of sign system that there are in animal organism, and there may be a lot of them different. And then what this interesting question is that there may be differences in different levels. So you may code the distinction between self and the environment one way, let's say in immunological level or cognitive level, and in different way, in totally different way in linguistic or in narrative level. And now, if you have this kind of incompatibilities, this is a point where a topic really becomes interesting. But let me stop here and ask that perhaps
can I add something?
Our participants also have some questions.
Yes, I have also to add, because as I mentioned in my earlier paper, some days ago, Sebeok did not define. He gave only many layers. So he says that it is multi-layer structure, etc., and it has immunological, neurological, cognitive, and other properties. So he did not distinguish between the self as with inherent properties and the self with relational properties. So then, if you mean environment, it is the relation of the self to the environment. Yes, this is the relational properties. Yes, and inherent, it is connected with the body and with the mind, of course, because the subjectivity, yes, is also relevant. And then the corporeal and the mental side of the self is important here. Yes, so this is it needs to be defined. Yes, but Sebeok, what he always did, he gave only more adjectives at the same side, not defining. Yes, he was analytical in such a case. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Murdeen, please.
Yes, thank you for the entire experience. A couple of strictly side notes. One is that semiotics as a comparative system probably comes from anthropology, as Sebeok was also an anthropologist, because anthropology has always distinguished itself as a comparative field, not necessarily capital S science. The other side note has to do with global semiotics, and it could be mentioned that Sebeok was, of course, in continuous contact with Lynn Margulis for two reasons. One was her 5 kingdoms of the living world, and the other was her collaboration with James Lovelock in the Gaia hypothesis, the Earth is a living organism. I think that's the background for his thinking about global matters. And one more thing about modeling systems, I'm not sure I would go as far as my collaborator, Sarah, to say that models are linked with functions exclusively, and nothing is exclusively function. Situations and processes persist without function as long as they're not shot down. And so there's always that going on. So focusing on function, I don't think was a prime mover in Sebeok's thought, because I think he realized function had been overdriven throughout the 20th century in all scientific thought. Thank you.
Sarah, would you like to?
Thinking. Yes, I suppose the idea that everything has a function has got more to do with who is observing that function, as if we know we have to find an explanation for everything, and yeah, an explanation looks at either what causes something or what brings, so what's the initial cause or what's its final cause? So what's the consequence of something? So I suppose function has got a lot to do with, but not exclusively. So a lot to do with observership. To use what, one of, in fact, Soren Brier's favorite concept, but not exclusively. And I still wonder whether you can have a model without a function.
Models can persist without, that is, state models as patterns can persist spuriously, and they do so. And we can look around the world today and see that lots of things are persisting without function in any Aristotelian notion. I think what's driving this pervasive misunderstanding about evolution, whether it's of systems or biology or humans, is the fact that we back into developmental narratives when we try to make sense of things narratively. So our narratives about evolution are all functional, but they don't capture evolution. These are developmental narratives that have beginnings and ends and something in between. And I think Stanley Salthy has made that most pregnant in his discussion of evolutionary vis-a-vis developmental systems. And I would take that further in all narratives. Most of our narratives, they're obliged to be linear because we speak linearly, even if we don't think linearly. So by the time we talk or write it down, it's already apt to be in a functionalistic linear fashion. But what we're trying to capture is not only that. Okay.
Kalevi, please.
Many thanks both to Sarah and to Timo for this very nice overviews where we can again see the richness of theoretical approaches also by Sebeok, which sometimes may become forgotten otherwise. I would like to point and repeat a term used by Timo. That's the third way of semiotics. So that's, I think, harmonizes very well with third way of evolution movement, what's active during the last decade, what does something the same. They integrates on one hand, on the other hand, actually, almost revolutionizes the field, in that case evolution, but here in semiotics. And I think this third way of semiotics could be nice term to use more, as this 20, well, that began, of course, with Sebeok very much, but now that's our task to go on with this, that integration of the semiotics via biosemiotics. And another little remark about Murdin's this anti-functionalist stance. I think that this should be understood in relation to Stephen Jay Gould's approach, where he was very much, criticizing the Darwinian view or Darwinian view altogether via overwhelming functionalism there. So that's reading Murdin's statement in this way, I would agree very much. Thanks.
Thank you. I take this as a comment, and I very much agree. And definitely this third way thinking in evolution, it's also pretty much related to like system biology and system thinking and local level regulation and feedback. So there are definitely commonalities, and it's a part of like a broader intellectual development, probably. Please, do we have any other? Paul, please, Paul.
Thanks, Timo. I'm loath to ask my own question, because I always have questions when we talk about Sebeok, but I'd like to point to one in the chat by Antti Ranvir, and your papers are perfect for this, because Sebeok didn't explicitly say anything at length about artificial intelligence. However, in respect of biosemiotics, and in particular the way that biosemiotics conceives of the sign and the self, it seems that there are pretty far-reaching conclusions to be made about artificial intelligence, extrapolating from your papers. But could you do that rather than me and Antti?
Yeah, thank you for reminding Antti's question. I was a bit troubled with that, because I also have a kind of feeling that I haven't read anything from Sebeok in regard to artificial intelligence. Yeah, well, extrapolating from that, probably Sebeok's thinking about artificial intelligence would be quite critical, especially because of this grounding and these different kind of hierarchical levels. It's not easy to see the kind of self-contained and self-sufficient thinking or intellectual system without any previous semiotic codes and without this, let's say, biosemiotic levels and embodiment. But it's difficult for me to develop from here on. So perhaps you yourself could add anything, or Antti perhaps could, because I think it's a very interesting direction of developing this dialogue or discussion.
Sarah, any thoughts? I'll just pass it back to you.
Yeah, I'll take it. Yes, I've also been thinking, and I suppose if I have to use the theoretical tools that we have, the primary, secondary, and tertiary model system, I would probably ask, is artificial intelligence capable of all three types of modeling? And according to how a scientist, perhaps, the engineers the computer scientists, the system engineers, according to whether they would answer yes or no to that question, I would then I would be able to have a better understanding myself. So do the people who build, I think would the builders be able to claim that you know, these artificial intelligence systems learned through imitative behavior, that is also the repository of feelings, unconscious feelings, or conscious feelings. So I mean, I'm not an engineer, so I can only answer from a point of view of, you know, someone who doesn't know what's in that technology. I mean, it's intelligence in the sense that it can really expand of our cognitive abilities to just make abstractions and computations that we could never make, really. So so that's one side of intelligence, and the other side of intelligence, you know, which is about understanding, or maybe not even understanding, simply being aware of feelings, states of beings and states of mind. Well, I don't think that's possible. So I would imagine that Sebeok would be critical that artificial intelligence would ever be able to cross that boundary. I would be skeptical of that. But then the real question is, even if artificial intelligence doesn't cross that boundary, even if it doesn't become capable of producing and processing primary forms, including emotions and feelings, does it matter? So I suppose a large variety of problems can be solved at a very superficial level without an awareness of emotions, without understanding emotions. So, you know, if you I can't remember when I was doing it, but I wanted to enroll in a course online, and, you know, inevitably there was no phone number to talk to anyone. There was just the chat box. And I thought, oh gosh, this is never going to happen. You know, I have a very complex questions, and this thing is never going to understand me, and it's not going to understand, it's not going to solve my problem, but it did. So I suppose the real question is, maybe artificial intelligence will not have feelings, but they will still solve our problems, some at least, and create others in the process.
Thank you. We have a question by Robert Innis, and I think this is the last one that we can take.
Okay, mine is it's a very short question in terms of being posed. It might take forever to answer it, but just connecting further on with this artificial intelligence issue, what type of body is connected to artificial intelligence? That is, what is intelligent in that particular format? Is it artificial intelligence obviously has to be materially embodied in some, is it only embodied in some formal system, or where in a sense is it? And I ask this question because it's very much connected with economic systems, with global economic systems, and the difference between making bets and having choices, and who really knows what the state of that system is. You say, well, it's embedded in the system. All the knowledge of the world economics structures are in those systems, but where are they? That's my question. It's probably unanswerable, but where are they? Is artificial intelligence, does it have a body? Dreyfus wrote a famous book on what computers can't do, and he argued that in principle, computers cannot really think. They can do all these other things for us, but they cannot think. They don't have bodies. They don't have feelings. They don't care.
Could they have an extended bodies? Extended.
Where is that body? Is it in the formal algorithms that are them? Where are they placed?
Mhm.
They seem to be no place, even though you can point to the computers, you can point to all these data systems, but where is it?
Can I just comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to think about the whole domain of extended cognition and robotics. And it's a question, if you use a computer, is it part of your cognitive system, for instance? It's a question. And there is a lot of discussions about about extended cognition and 4E cognition and so. So a formal system, there is the embodiment in the physical system is not relevant if you speak of a formal system. But if you speak of an artificial system or artificial intelligence, then you can share your own knowledge, which has some embodiment in your body, and you can extend it also with extensions. And this can be a computer. If you are playing piano, for instance, and you use an instrument, then this is a kind of appendix of your body. But you can do this with full control. But if you give also the control to the system, then you have a kind of addition of external intelligence. This is a very hot discussion. It's very interesting, but it's not solved. And I think especially the biosemiotics is very interesting. If you go back to von Uck's school and you have your sensory tools and your motor tools and so, this is in Germany. This is the seminal paper, I should say, the start of thinking about extension of our cognition. We are continuously in interaction with our environment. And by doing these interactions, we are building up cognition. And then you can have this cognition in our biological memory, but you can offload it also on your computer and on your hard disk. And most people, especially the young people now, they use the smartphones as a kind of extension, as a kind of prosthesis of their body. And this is also artificial intelligence, but you can have connection. But if you have a robot and robotics, you can cut off the connection also with your offloaded system. And we have to think about, it's not solvable in 2 minutes, but I think this is very, very interesting for biosemiotics, especially in biosemiotics. It means that we think about the biological system, but computers are not biological systems. These are formal systems and computational systems, but there is a kind of materialization in the physical structure of the computer. And this is also, it's also kind of external embodiment. So you have your own body and you have your external body. And this is called extended cognition. And then you have to look the papers, the books by Clark and Kimero and all these kinds of things. Extended cognition can find a lot of things, but it's a very young discipline. And this means also, if you go to Kuhn and the structure of scientific resolutions, he says you have stages in this development. And the first stage, it means that we are looking for concepts and definitions and terminologies. And we do not yet agree about these things. The question also, what is artificial intelligence? It's a question. And there are many answers. And at this stage, the answers are not yet converging. And this is so interesting, but it's very difficult. And what we need is a kind of operational definition of all these kinds. If you think about Peirce with his more than 19 categories, it's so difficult, and it's so difficult to do the implementation in empirical sciences. So we have to look for a reduction, and we have to use the methods also of the hard sciences to put these categories to make them more simple and not so many of them. Peirce also was, his whole life, he was always searching and changing his definitions. He was a very interesting scholar. But the Peirce at one moment in his life was totally different from the Peirce in a later stage. He was always, it was a kind of scholar in progress, I should say. And this is the same with biosemiotics. We are also in progress, but you have to look for definitions and operational definitions that you can say, what is intelligence? What is embodiment? What are all kind of things? And I think
thank you. Thank you for this development and ideas. I just to wrap it somehow together, I think what Robert mentioned about caring, that artificial intelligence do not care. This is something that you kind of ended your comment. And then so to kind of reflect this back to the Sebeok, the topics of discontinuity and being disconnected, probably, or being connected to this well, topic of artificial intelligence. Probably these are something that bring into light within Sebeok's thinking. But thank you all for participating today, and please be sure to take part of following webinars by Sebeok as well.
Yeah, thank you.